In recent years, a significant political and moral debate has taken shape between African nations and Western powers, most notably between the United States and South Africa, centered around the issue of land reform and national sovereignty. One of the most controversial moves in this debate came when former U.S. President Donald Trump made the decision to halt aid to South Africa. His justification for this move was rooted in the belief that the South African government was forcibly taking land from the white minority, a claim that sparked international outrage and deepened the divide between African aspirations and Western expectations. Trump's position was interpreted by many as a defense of South Africa's white minority, who make up less than 10% of the population but still hold control of an estimated 70 to 75% of privately owned land. His decision sent a clear signal: the United States under his leadership would not support any attempts to disrupt the existing distribution of land, even if that distribution was a direct consequence of colonization and apartheid. In essence, Trump's actions were seen not only as an economic sanction but as an ideological endorsement of maintaining historical inequalities. This stance immediately sparked backlash across the African continent. Trump's move was perceived as a blatant attempt to interfere in the domestic affairs of a sovereign nation, one that was trying to address a legacy of deep injustice. South Africa's land reform efforts aimed to reverse decades of dispossession endured by the black majority. During apartheid and colonial rule, black South Africans were pushed off their ancestral lands and denied the right to own property. When apartheid officially ended in 1994, land redistribution became a critical part of the country's promises for equality and restitution. However, progress has been slow, and frustration among the marginalized majority has only grown over the years. The South African government's more recent push to speed up land redistribution, sometimes proposing to do so without compensation, was met with fierce resistance from certain international actors, including the United States. Trump's public statements were based on unverified reports that white farmers in South Africa were being systematically attacked and murdered, claims that South African officials strongly refuted. Instead, they emphasized that the reforms were legal, transparent, and necessary to correct historical wrongs. The message many African leaders heard from Trump was not one of concern for justice, but rather one of preserving the economic dominance of a privileged few. In supporting the landowners and punishing South Africa for attempting change, the Trump administration appeared to be protecting colonial legacies rather than encouraging equity and progress. It was as if Washington wanted African countries to remain dependent, compliant, and unwilling to assert their rights. However, the United States did not find a uniformly receptive audience in Africa. One of the boldest rejections of Trump's stance came from Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso. Traoré publicly condemned the idea that African nations should be punished for making decisions that benefit their own people. He refused to align with Trump's directive, instead standing firm in his belief that African countries must reclaim their right to determine their own policies, especially when it comes to critical issues like land and resource ownership. Captain Traoré's defiance was more than just symbolic, it was part of a larger awakening happening across the continent. African leaders and citizens alike are increasingly asserting their independence from foreign influence, especially when such influence seeks to preserve systems that have historically oppressed the majority. Traoré made it clear that Burkina Faso, and Africa more broadly, should no longer be treated as a pawn in Western geopolitical games. His message was simple but powerful: African nations must be free to pursue justice for their people without fear of economic retribution from former colonial powers. Trump's actions were not just about land reform in South Africa, they were part of a broader pattern of how powerful nations use aid as a tool of control. By threatening to cut financial assistance, the U.S. hoped to coerce South Africa into abandoning its plans. But this tactic raised a fundamental question: should aid be used to shape the policies of sovereign nations, especially when those policies are intended to redress long-standing inequalities? Many African leaders and civil society organizations answered with a resounding no. They argued that aid should be given in good faith, not as a means of manipulation. To use aid as leverage, they contended, is to deny developing nations their agency. It is to perpetuate the very systems of dominance and dependency that Africans have fought to escape since the era of independence. In fact, the land question in South Africa has been central to the country's identity and post-apartheid development. Land is more than just a physical resource, it's a symbol of heritage, dignity, and economic opportunity. For the millions of black South Africans who still live in poverty, the promise of land reform remains unfulfilled. Without meaningful access to land, true freedom and prosperity remain out of reach. Yet every time the South African government has attempted to make progress, powerful interests, both local and international, have pushed back. Some argue that redistribution will hurt the economy, scare away investors, or lead to instability. Others claim it's a form of reverse racism. But to the South African majority, these arguments ring hollow. They see them as attempts to maintain a system where a privileged few continue to benefit while the many remain trapped in cycles of poverty. By cutting aid, Trump appeared to take the side of the status quo. He chose to side with the beneficiaries of apartheid-era policies rather than with the victims of those policies. This sent a chilling message, not just to South Africa but to the entire African continent: progress would come at a price, and that price would be imposed by external powers. But Africa is changing. The continent is witnessing a growing movement for self-determination, fueled by young leaders, social movements, and communities that refuse to be dictated to by outsiders. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's refusal to comply with Trump's expectations is emblematic of this shift. His leadership, along with others who share his vision, represents a new era in African politics, one where dignity, sovereignty, and justice take precedence over foreign approval. African nations are no longer content with being told what to do by powers that once colonized them. The memory of colonialism is still fresh, and its consequences are still felt. Land dispossession was one of its most devastating effects, and for many Africans, reclaiming land is not just a policy, it's a moral imperative. The Trump administration's attempt to influence South Africa's internal land policies also highlighted a double standard. The U.S. did not intervene in similar ways in other countries facing land disputes. This led many to question whether Trump's decision was motivated by principle or by political alignment with the white minority in South Africa. Human rights groups and analysts criticized the move as selective and hypocritical, suggesting that the real issue was not about violence or justice, but about protecting certain economic interests. Despite international pressure, South Africa has remained committed to its land reform agenda. The government has made it clear that it will not be intimidated into abandoning its efforts to right historical wrongs. The path forward may be complex and contentious, but for many South Africans, it is a necessary journey toward equity and national healing. The ripple effects of Trump's decision continue to be felt across the continent. While some governments remained silent or neutral, others took note of South Africa's courage and Burkina Faso's defiance. A quiet solidarity is growing among African nations, a shared understanding that they must support each other in their pursuit of justice, even in the face of global resistance. Captain Traoré's bold stance has positioned him as a symbol of this new African consciousness. By refusing to bow to Western pressure, he has inspired others to question the motives behind foreign aid and to demand greater control over their country's futures. His leadership is part of a wider trend, one that rejects the paternalism of the past and embraces a vision of Africa led by Africans, for Africans. Trump's move to cut aid to South Africa may have been intended as a warning, but it has instead fueled a deeper determination among African leaders to stand firm. Rather than isolate South Africa, it drew attention to the injustices that land reform seeks to address. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that many Western powers are still unwilling to support African solutions to African problems, especially when those solutions threaten entrenched interests. The situation in South Africa remains unresolved, but the country's commitment to change endures. The land issue is far from settled, and the road ahead is likely to be filled with legal, political, and economic hurdles. Yet, what is clear is that the winds of change are blowing across the continent. The old patterns of control and compliance are breaking down, and a new narrative is emerging, one of empowerment, resistance, and hope. In the end, Trump's decision to withdraw aid did not weaken the movement for land reform, it strengthened it. It exposed the lengths to which powerful nations will go to protect their interests, and it revealed the courage of African leaders who refuse to be bullied. Figures like Captain Ibrahim Traoré remind the world that Africa is not a continent to be dictated to. It is a continent with its own voice, its own will, and its own destiny. As South Africa continues its journey toward a more just society, and as more African leaders stand up for sovereignty, the continent edges closer to reclaiming what was taken. The fight for land is a fight for dignity. And in that fight, Africa is finding its power, not in compliance, but in defiance. The message is clear: Africa will no longer be a silent participant in its own story. It will write its future on its own terms.